Hello, many people. My name is Robert Jago. I'm an occasional contributor to the Walrus magazine and other places. I run on First Nations issues. I come from BC, and I'm a member of the Kwantlen First Nation, part of the Salish people, which I mention only for context. I'm going to be talking about Canada and what it will look like with respect to First Nations in the coming decades. But before that, I think I should take a step back and talk about where my thinking on this subject comes from. The past week has been, for me, bad. I've been in and out of hospital with my mother. I've had to help bury 2 uncles. And for Salish people, that's literally what we do. It's step 6 of our very long, convoluted funeral process. It involves a shovel and a long queue of people. Queuing up to bury your relative is just one of the steps. Another one is burning all their stuff, which is another thing we did earlier this week. If you've ever heard of the expression, "you can't take it with you," we do not have that expression in our culture. For us, you take it with you, which I know might sound strange to some people. The image of burning books and photos and putting all of their treasured belongings on a funeral pyre. For me, at a point, it was strange as well. But the dominance in our culture, in our lives, the normalization of it, has been on an upward trend since the early 1990s. In the 90s, the first post-residential school generation came of age. They were born without the stigma of being Native, and they sought to reclaim their roots. They built new houses of worship, they resurrected the long-dead ceremonies and festivals, they rebuilt our culture from the ground up. And these are the people that we buried this week. I was young when these things were brought back, and learned many of these things as if they were a foreign culture. But after Oka, after discovering how menacingly racist so many of our neighbors were, we were all open to finding pride in who we were. Today, these cultures are practiced as the natural state of affairs among the young. My nephew is 8. He drops words from our language into everyday conversation. He makes our sign of prayer when he's begging his mother for something. This is the culture that he was born into, and he lives it more than I could hope to. He lives it more than my parents could dream of, and he lives it in a way that my grandmother, a residential school survivor, would be deeply, deeply ashamed of. My nephew will grow up. He will have children, and as the generations progress and the scope of our resurgence will expand, and as it expands, it will move from faith more and more into politics, and ultimately the thing we natives all see as endpoints: land and sovereignty. This is the only thing you can universally generalize about natives. We all want our land back. I want to paint a picture of what that could look like, this future Canada, circa 2068, when they'll be burning my stuff on the funeral pyre. This is a Canada where the map has changed drastically. We've moved beyond treaties. There's no longer a Department of Indian Affairs, but there are 10 provinces, 3 territories, and dozens of Indigenous republics. Each republic in total control of their territory, entirely self-governing with all the powers of a province and more, and an integral part of a new Canadian Union of Peoples, with no blockades or blocked pipelines, but where we all develop and build together. This is a Canada that has been refounded, reborn, and restarted, taking us back to where we were circa 1812. Think of that war. Don't worry about who did or didn't burn down the White House. But think about who was there on the border defending the territory that would become Canada. It was English militia and French militia, but it was also Native nations and their warriors. If it weren't for them, this would not be Canada today. The Canada of 1812, and of all of the wars before then, was a partnership between 3 peoples: the English, the French, and First Nations. This is the union that made Canada. This is the only structure that can make Canada whole, and this is who we are in 2068. I recently asked a group of self-described non-Native allies, white people, of Indigenous people what they want from First Nations in return for their support of our cause. They told me directly that they want us to forgive them. They want us to forgive Canada and to say Canada is a good country. All that stuff that happened before is good. So, to be honest, talking to Native people across Canada, I was on the TP in Parliament Hill last year, talking to these people, even the militants, there's widespread agreement that actually that's what we all want. We all want that vision, that we all think that that's possible. And looking back from 2068, where it has been achieved, we could see that it began here in our time with reconciliation. It began with a nation-to-nation relationship. We know the state of affairs on reserve. Everybody knows all the stories about what happens there. We know about the poverty and the poor housing. We know about the paternalism of federal authorities, which maybe we don't talk about enough. But in this future, this changed right about now. Everything that the Trudeau government promised, they delivered on. We began first by fixing the problems, not by diktat from Ottawa, not as a handout from Indian Affairs, but by placing the tools back into the hands of my generation. And with those tools, and with more and more of the money produced by the resources taken from our land, we began to improve things. We patched up the roofs, we wiped out the rules that prevented people from fixing their homes, we created water systems, education systems, child welfare systems, and developed an environment conducive to real entrepreneurship. And we began to expand. Success is popular in rising property values in the big cities, the presence of jobs in reserve. These things, in the 20s and 30s, these are the things that will bring people home. They'll bring back our best and brightest. They'll spur even more growth. And with growth and the return of many of these people, we will lift First Nations people out of poverty. But with that rise out of poverty, as we've seen all over the world, this new growing middle class that will develop will demand more. And that's the child of reconciliation. That's the future of the 2030s and 40s. This will spur a demand for more political freedoms, more rights, more land. It's a universal rule that Canada is not immune to. And it is this critical mass that will push us over the Rubicon and into the uncharted territory for Canada, territory where big concessions must finally be made. As our reserves grow, the pressure for more control of land and resources will create a crisis for Canada. But this is a Canada that would have seen the success of reconciliation, that would have seen booming reserves and aggressive young leaders of First Nations who are open to a final settlement. This is a Canada of 2040 or 2050 where its own leaders grew up knowing nothing but equality and progress for First Nations. And so the next necessary steps will be far easier for them. Ending the Indian Act, moving past the treaties, a new constitutional round that recognizes vastly expanding First Nations land, and where First Nations are asked to join as full members of the new state with their own senators, their own members of parliament, and where in partnership with Quebec and English Canada, they together set the new national priorities. These new First Nations republics in Canada will have everything they need to succeed. The children of 2050 couldn't imagine the poverty of today. They couldn't imagine that it was so near to them. They will know only success. They'll see their flags flying, they'll live and work in native towns and cities, they'll grow up healthy, secure, protected, and they won't know things like suicide or murder. At last, they'll just be children. And it's from them, from the reconciliation of today, which led to the development of tomorrow, which led to pressure from new Native middle classes in the 2030s, from the Great Compromise of the 2050s, but we come to these people in 2068. It's them that can give you what you want. It's that young woman at the center, there in blue, the smiling person, smiling, living a full Native life for the first time in 2 centuries. A woman with a certain and positive future. That's the person there in 2068 who will be able to tell you that the past is not forgotten, but it is forgiven. She's the one that will be able to say to this country that Canada is good. But of course, she doesn't exist. She doesn't exist. That girl, if we're honest with each other, she can't exist. A truly reconciled Canada is science fiction. And it's fiction because that young woman can't exist with this young woman on the signs. She can't exist without this young man. Because to be a Canada where reconciliation was real, where it could lead to progress, to a middle class, and to a final settlement between our peoples, where we could all live together happily, we would have to go back in time. Because you can't have that Canada without Colton Boushie, or Tina Fontaine, or any of the other dozens of names we've seen over the last few years, and the many more forgotten names that we should have but didn't see in the years before. No mother wants her child to grow up to be a hashtag, but that's the reality for too many Native women. And that reality has been beaten over our heads for the last few years, making us know that reconciliation is a fairy tale told to put liberal voters to sleep. It's not meant for us. Canada has no respect for our national rights. The recent pipeline debacle tells you this, if you didn't already know it. These republics will come to be, and to give you what you really want, real absolution, Canada would have to be a different country, and it isn't. This is what it is. And so what does that actually mean for the future? Our numbers will still grow. Our culture and politics will still advance. But unlike in the Canadian Union model I just proposed, we won't be building things together. We'll be pursuing our path, and you will be pursuing yours. And when they come into opposition, we'll be pursuing our path and you'll be pursuing yours, and when our two paths come into opposition, there will be conflict. And as we have today on the pipeline and tomorrow in the Ring of Fire here in Ontario, it's clear that we're not welcome in Canada's politics. When issues of national importance come up, we don't even get a spot at the kids' table. But my generation and those younger aren't content to sit on the sidelines and be spectators in our own lives. And so all over, what we're seeing is people taking charge, taking care of each other. And this can be seen in things like the Bear Clan Patrol. These people on the screen now, these are people who take to the streets to take care of Native kids at night. We also see it in things like the Crazy Indians Brotherhood, feeding the homeless, helping the poor, and when you can't trust the police, stepping in and handing out justice for you. At a very small cost, you could have had a more prosperous future, a more just future, without this guilt hanging over you. Instead, what you'll get is something messy and confrontational, with the civil society of an entire people directed against you. The Canada of 2068 will be hostile. It will be poorer than it needs to be, and the Native youth of it in it will have grown up knowing nothing but opposition and conflict. And just as our faith and ceremonies have become second nature to my 8-year-old nephew, this hostility and conflict will become second nature to the children of the future. And this is what they will build upon. At a point, these things gain a momentum that can't be stopped. Or maybe it just seems that way. After all, how many times in the last 50 years has something that seems immutable, cast in stone, changed completely over a matter of a few years? If Canada is to survive to 2168, that type of change is what needs to happen. Should we ask that young woman of 2068 to do it? To take the decades of resistance culture and turn it on its head? And what, assimilate? Or should we ask you to do it, here in 2018, when the cost isn't yet too high? To change, understand that reconciliation as it's presented to you is a lie. Understand that the Assembly of First Nations that your government negotiates with has no support among Native people. It's seen as the equivalent of a rat union. Understand that your wealth comes from Native lands. Understand that your government continues today through the systems of control under the Indian Act to treat people like they were children. Understand that, and then decide that changing is more important than appeasing foreign oil interests. Decide that changing is more important than lowering the unemployment rate from 4.5 to 4.4%. It's more important than lowering the deficit and paying down the debt. After all, none of these things matter if you don't have a country. And if there is to be a Canada worth living in, someone has to decide to change. Thank you.